Just to recap what we talked about last week, we saw that actually science is a gift from God, which was inspired by the doctrines of the Bible. Daniel?
The largest financer of research into the Big Bang is actually the Catholic Church.
Oh, that's interesting. Actually, science originated within the church because of these different doctrines. The invitation from God to investigate nature and to think his thoughts after him. And indeed, the church was the chief sponsor of science for like 120 years. So there should only be a conflict between science and God. The conflicts that we do see are kind of religious conflicts rather than scientific. A couple of quotes here from last time, showing that really the origin of stars and even our own sun is far from explained in a scientific way. So according to the Big Bang theory, stars shouldn't really even exist. Now, this may be surprising to us, but I'll talk a little bit about it here very quickly. So as you may know, the theory is that after the Big Bang, stars supposedly form from gas clouds collapsing into each other through gravity. The problem with that is it doesn't really work in real life. Collapsing gas clouds, they tend to create very tremendous outward forces due to many factors, such as, trying to preserve angular momentum, whatever that means. Okay, don't worry about it. Also magnetic fields and so on. And so it comes to a phase where even if they collapse, a force will disperse the gas all over again. So it's really impossible for this scenario to work. So what are some solutions that have been proposed? So here are some solutions. Maybe supernovas, which are exploding stars, will cause the pressure necessary to force gases together. Dust grains, which come from supernovas, again, may cool down, the gas clouds and let them continue to collapse. Maybe emissions from black holes may also provide the pressure for gas clouds to keep collapsing. Maybe the pressure from galaxies, from gas clouds colliding or mixing together, right, might provide that pressure. And lastly, radiation from nearby stars might help to do that. Yes, Daniel?
Just to kind of draw, I don't know anything about dust grains, but the problem with the first one, supernovas, is that the matter from stars after they have a supernova spreads across space and time. That's why we get like gold, for example. I mean, it doesn't collect back together. Black hole emissions don't make sense because the gravity of black holes means that nothing can escape from them. So how would there be emissions? The problem with galaxies colliding is that the universe is expanding. So galaxies are expanding with it. So there is no collisions between galaxies. It goes into the fourth one, or the last one, radiation from nearby stars. Stars are also expanding away from each other. So the radiation really wouldn't be able to touch upon each other and create that mass. So I don't know about dust grains. That might be a good one, but the other ones scientifically don't actually really make sense.
Yeah, for black hole emissions, they posit that there's still emissions beyond the event horizon. So some good points there, but there's an even more fundamental problem with these possible explanations. So again, what are supernovas? An exploding star, right? And then dust grains from supernovas, okay, that's again from supernovas, which are an exploding star. What does the black hole come from? It's a star, right? It's a collapsing star. Galaxies, what are galaxies? Galaxies are bunches of stars, right? What's wrong with all these scenarios? All require stars to exist before more stars can be made. We're trying to explain where stars come from. All these scenarios require stars to exist before they can work. So this is part of the state of where the Big Bang theory is. The kind of unexplained star. So every time you look up in the sky, you have to remember that there's no explanation for it in the secular term. Now, we'll hear more about the Big Bang in a later class, but I just want to kind of give you a taste of what's going on. As our space probes in the last few years have gone out and taken pictures and sent them back to us, this is the kind of thing that we see. There's so many surprises in our solar system alone that don't fit with the theory. And I'll just tell you that basically everything looks too young. Much too young. Okay, so I'll leave it there for now. If you want more, I've provided a link to a much longer presentation. You can watch on your own. So again, to recap what we talked about, micro versus macro evolution. Micro evolution is something that is observed and for minor changes, and it hasn't been shown to develop a novel, useful structure. Macro evolution is an overarching framework for how all life came to be, starting from one cell, which is a different thing altogether. So the big question is whether we can extrapolate from micro to macro evolution. It doesn't matter, to us.
I think just because we talk, I can see the delineation between macro and micro evolution, but I guess my question is, based on last class, what is the definition that you're using for science and religion for these classes, and what would be the reasoning behind those definitions?
The reason is because what is done in the evolution debate is to confuse the general public and even scientists, is to take the certainties of microevolution and then extrapolate them to macroevolution without any observational evidence.
Oh, no, not evolution. I can see that. I'm not. What are the definitions you're using for science and religions?
Science, I would say, the scientific method, the scientific framework, observation and experiments and a hypothesis, falsification. When I say it's a religious debate, what I mean is that the objections or the arguments that are being made regarding evolution, regarding the Big Bang, a lot of them are actually not scientific objections. They're not things we can measure or prove. They're actually just assumptions. For example, in astronomy, there's something called the Copernican principle. The Big Bang theory relies on the principle that there's no place in the universe is special. And they call that the Copernican principle. One very important result of this assumption is that there's no center of the universe. Now, that may seem strange to us, but if you think of a balloon and the surface of a balloon expanding, they say that's what the universe is. It's kind of like that. There's no real center. It's just a surface. There's no special place on the surface of a balloon. Is that a scientific deduction? No, it's not. It's a purely philosophical deduction to avoid any special places in the universe. And so that's what I call a religious objection. It's not scientifically proven. Yeah, and there are many more of these. I think we'll cover some of them. Another one is inflation, not the one we're experiencing now, but the Big Bang. The Big Bang has a huge problem, which is so the Big Bang. Of course, there's a point when everything was condensed into one tiny point, and everything kind of expanded outwards. The problem with that is with the size of the universe, there hasn't been enough time for all the different regions of the universe to be in contact with one another, even at the speed of light. But when we look at the universe today, the temperature is uniform everywhere. How is that possible, right? It takes a little bit longer explanation, and in one of those videos will show you. But to resolve this, they propose that after the Big Bang, suddenly everything expanded at many, many times the speed of light, and then it suddenly stopped. So that's called inflation. There's no proof for it. There's no explanation for it. That's simply something they posited so that the model can work. So that's a religious explanation to me. It's just so the theory doesn't fall apart.
Very quickly, and Guan and I have discussed this before, I think the bigger problem with the Big Bang is that what is the energy that was applied to the Big Bang that initiated it? Otherwise, right. There had to be something that started it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have, unless there's something special about the Big Bang and that doesn't apply, the thermodynamics doesn't apply to it, which doesn't really make sense either.
Right. Christians fall into different camps on the Big Bang. The thing we can all agree with is that the current science shows that there was a beginning, which is what the Bible says. And that's the problem. How did the beginning happen? Like you said, everything supposedly came from nothing. How did that happen? So there had to be a cause outside of this universe. And that's the big question. What is the cause? I think that's the question we can ask anybody without having to understand the Big Bang. All we have to understand about the Big Bang is that it includes everything we see. Everything about the universe and its laws and its matter and energy is included in the Big Bang, including time. So how did they all come out of nothing? And if you've heard about quantum fluctuations, that's cheating. So you may know that the space we see as empty space around us has quantum fields, and there's energy in there. And so there's proposals that the Big Bang came from quantum fluctuations. But quantum fields are not nothing. They're something. They're part of the something that was created in the Big Bang. Before the Big Bang, there's no quantum fields. There was nothing in this universe. So again, you don't really have to feel on the defensive when you talk about science, because a lot of the things that we hear are really scientifically true. They're more religious statements. So for example, we hear stories about, the new images show us, how stars are being born, right? Is that really what's going on? Not really. That's not really scientifically accurate. So there's science, which everybody accepts and agrees on. And then there's scientists who they all have different biases and blind spots, right? As human beings, there's a difference. So we just have to realize what these differences are. The other reason I frame it as a religious debate is because there are a lot of things which are not going to be allowed to be considered just because the Big Bang, the naturalistic explanation has to be true or has to be found, right? So, and we see that more in evolution. Well, it's both fields really. But what I want to do here is really show you a couple of things which, even if so, you don't have to really understand what's going on apart from these are things that are going on in your body, all right? And it's why the science is pointing more and more towards God, all right, in the past decade or so. So I just want to show you something here which I couldn't show you last week, and hopefully
the process of dividing a cell takes around an hour in mammals. So this footage is from a time lapse. You can see how the chromosomes line up on the equator of the cell. Now, when everything is right, they are pulled apart into the two new daughter cells, each one containing an identical copy of DNA. Now, simple as this looks, the process is incredibly complicated and requires even more fascinating molecular machines to accomplish it. So let's look at a single chromosome. One chromosome consists of two sausage-shaped chromatids containing the identical copies of DNA made earlier. Each chromatid is attached to microtubule fibers, which guide and help align them in the correct position. The microtubules are connected to the chromatid at the kinetochore, here colored red. The kinetochore consists of hundreds of different proteins working together to achieve multiple objectives. In fact, it's one of the most sophisticated molecular mechanisms inside your body. The kinetochore is central to the successful separation of the chromatids. It creates a dynamic connection between the chromosome and the microtubules. For a reason no one's yet been able to figure out, the microtubules are constantly being built at one end and deconstructed at the other.
So the microtubules are those long, kind of highway-looking things on the left.
While the chromosome is still getting ready, the kinetochore sends out a chemical stop signal to the rest of the cell, shown here by the red molecules, basically saying this chromosome is not yet ready to divide. The kinetochore also mechanically senses tension. When the tension is just right and the position and attachment are correct, all the proteins get ready, shown here by turning green. At this point, the stop signal broadcasting system is not switched off. Instead, it is literally carried away from the kinetochore down the microtubules by a dynein motor. That's the walking guy. This is really what it looks like. It has long legs so it can avoid obstacles and step over the kinesins, molecular motors that walk in the opposite direction. What it looks like. It has long legs so it can avoid obstacles and step over the...
Now, so what... So this is one of the most basic things we need for you to function, which is cells to divide, have identical copies of the DNA. And we have discovered that the way that it works, okay, is you have to have these little guys walking along, carrying away these signal proteins.
So it can avoid obstacles and step over the kind.
Okay, and then these blue guys over here, they're a different kind of walking machine. Okay, let me see if they're walking or not. Oh yeah, they are walking.
That walk in the opposite direction.
They are walking the opposite direction. So this is a very basic function of life, which if you look in this, this level, you can say, well, okay, it's kind of easy. It's just a cell splitting together, no big deal, right? But once we discover that you have these little machines required for it to work, I think the picture comes a little bit different, okay? Now, here's another one, and this is even more basic. So
if there were a device that untangled knots automatically inside your body, there is. It's called a topoisomerase. It untangles knots in our DNA in an incredible process that keeps us all alive. DNA carries assembly instructions required for your body to generate new cells. But for DNA to do its work, it must be copied in a process known as replication. During replication, the DNA strands are separated, and protein machines use each strand to make a copy of the opposite strand. The end result is 2 copies of the original DNA. However, DNA replication faces a life or death challenge before it can complete its mission. Separating the DNA strands causes twisting in the portion of DNA that has not yet been separated. Eventually, the tension from the twisting increases so much that the uncopied segment of DNA wraps around itself in what are referred to as supercoils. If nothing intervenes, this buildup of supercoils will completely shut down the DNA replication process, since the 2 strands can no longer be separated, and your cells will die. Enter special proteins called topoisomerases to the rescue. Topoisomerases are amazing molecular machines that untangle knots. They come in 2 main types. Type 2 typically has 3 main sections: an upper gate, a middle gate, and a lower gate. Each gate can open or close during the protein's operation. A type 2 topoisomerase untangles DNA in 4 main steps. First, after 2 DNA segments enter through the top gate, it uses the middle gate to break 1 segment of DNA apart. Next, it passes the other DNA segment through this break. Then occurs the crucial step. The topoisomerase recombines the first DNA segment. The result is the elimination of 2 supercoils. Finally, now that the 2 DNA segments have been untangled, they are released by the topoisomerase. The second strand is released out the bottom, and the first strand is released out the top. Of course, this is just a simple summary. The actual process is a lot more complicated. Get ready for a more detailed version of how this process may take place based upon the latest research. When we zoom in on the upper part of the topoisomerase, one of the 2 overlapping DNA segments enters the upper gate. It then binds to the middle gate. Now the second DNA segment enters the upper gate. The DNA in the middle gate is cut in 2 by the topoisomerase. 2 ATP molecules attach to the upper gate, and the gate closes. One of the ATP molecules is broken apart into ADP and phosphate, releasing energy that may help keep the upper gate together during the next steps. The middle gate now opens and pulls the 2 halves of the broken DNA apart, creating a gap. Since the middle gate is connected to the broken ends, the DNA remains attached to it. The second DNA segment now moves through this gap. The middle gate closes, and the attached DNA ends are reconnected. The upper gate rotates, which may prevent the second segment from moving back through the break. The remaining ATP molecule breaks apart, and the lower gate opens, allowing the second DNA segment to leave. Then the lower gate closes, the upper gate opens, and the first segment of DNA is finally released. The topoisomerase is now reset, ready to perform the same process all over again. The topoisomerase molecular machine is a wonder of the biological world. Its operation is highly orchestrated, displaying exquisite and intelligent design.
I think we're at a point, in our knowledge of the molecular, seeing something like that, I think it's really hopeless to try to hope that there's a naturalistic explanation of how this came into being, how it evolved by chance over time. This is, again, crucial for DNA to be replicated, at least anything with any appreciable length. That's where we are right now in the science. To claim something like it evolved is really drawing upon miracles. Also, I just wanted to share that with you, even if we can't really explain it in great detail. It's the same with most any biological feature needed for life. If you look at photosynthesis, ATP, the immune system, it's just mind-bogglingly complex. And you got to remember that these are all accomplished just using physical building blocks, right? It's like I gave you a Lego set with some Velcro, some magnets, and said, here, go ahead and build a system like this. And I think once you begin to sit down and try to do that, you see how crazy it is to see it can come out by chance. And I mentioned James Tour before. He builds little racing cars out of atoms, right? He knows how origin of life research goes. So I've given you a link there to watch on your own. And it says, when I talk with these National Academy people, not in public, I said, do you understand all this and how this happens? And they always say, no, I don't. It's very different from what, is said in public. Basically, even intelligent scientists can't figure out how to do it in the lab in highly controlled environments, but they're claiming that it happened by accident, right? So, and again, here's a very basic problem that cannot be solved. So one is the cell membrane. So to have life, you need a protective shell around your RNA or DNA or whatever it is to keep it safe from the outside world. There's all kinds of toxins and environmental problems. And so you need to protect these things. And what we have here is a membrane, right? Our cell is this membrane made out of these two layers. The problem is, if you have a cell membrane, now you have another problem, which is nutrients can't get into the cell and waste can't get out of the cell, right? Only small neutral molecules can get through. But if you can't get amino acids into the cell, for example, the cell's going to die. That's it. And so it's been acknowledged that the strong barrier function of membranes has made it difficult to understand the origin of cellular life. I'll give you a link there to see more about it. Yeah, Daniel? Here we have another schematic of a cell membrane. And you can see that all these little blue things in the diagram, they're all special channels and proteins that are required to let nutrients in, basically, different types of molecules, and get rid of waste, right? Let things pass through the barrier. It's kind of like the border, right? So all these are required at the beginning. Whenever you got the first cell membrane to actually form, you need these at the same time for the cell to live. And these are highly complex structures. It's hard to see because, again, this is blood biology. I mean, it's useful for us to see what's going on. These are actually how some of these things are made. If you look on the right, they're made up of atoms, building blocks, amino acids, proteins, and they become proteins, which has very specific shapes to allow these things to become gates for different types of things, right? So they must have arisen at the same time as membranes. And then, we have the origins of the membranes and membrane proteins remains enigmatic. What does that mean? Remains enigmatic?
We don't know.
We don't know. That's what it means. We don't know. This is the most basic problem to solve in origin of life. And I don't see any way it can be solved. So this is just one of the pumps. It's a channel that allows water to get into a cell. Water can't just get through the membrane. It's got to have this channel to get into the cell. So on the left is the simplified schematic of the protein structure. On the right shows you, it sits in the cell membrane. And you can see water molecules, individual molecules, going through the channel from the top to the bottom. Right in the middle there, the channel is just about the size of a single water molecule, all right? But it's even more amazing than that. So here's another schematic of that same channel, all right? And you see all these, plus signs on the right. So here's a size restriction, okay? Then it says electrostatic repulsion. And then it says water dipole reorientation. Okay, so what all that means is this channel is designed so that when the water gets through the channel flips the water molecule, all right? At just the right moment, it flips it, and then it flips it back. Now, why does it need to flip it? Well, if you have a chain of water molecules like this, okay, the hydrogen atoms kind of create an electric channel, electric conduction channel, right? And the hydrogen ions will just kind of keep going into the cell. And the hydrogen ions are positively charged, and they're going to mess up the charge inside the cell. Okay, the charge inside the cell needs to be negative for the cell to survive. Something like this alone should just totally break any illusions we have about evolution. So it's not just that the channel is required to let water into the cell; it has to flip. It's got to flip the water molecule. Again, the more science progresses, the more we see how impossible evolution becomes. We know DNA uses these 4 bases to specify the information in the middle here, right? For use for building proteins. But in DNA, the one here, the C, cytosine, degrades into something else called uracil. Now, uracil can pair with any other base here. So over time, what would happen? If all the cytosine becomes uracil, then there'll be total confusion of the DNA. Fortunately, there's a repair enzyme that keeps changing the uracil back, the U back to the C. Wow, that's really lucky, huh? So when must this repair enzyme have been present? It's got to be really from the very beginning. You can watch about other DNA repair mechanisms. These are things which we're learning, which, for example, again, Anthony Flew, the ex-atheist, said 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design. So I didn't want to overload you with science stuff today. We talked about how really a lot of the microevolution we see is really by degrading information instead of creating it. That's a book you could read to read up on that. Darwin Devolves. The most devastating doubts about evolution are science-based, not faith-based. Okay, and all these aspects of the theory really have been debunked in the past few decades. But since it's a religion, they cling to it. There's no alternative. The fossil record has been debunked. That was decades ago, but it's gotten even worse with new discoveries in China. So Stephen Mayer has a book about that. The limits to evolutionary change and so forth. Science is really on the side of creation. I talked about last week about homology. You can look at this on your own. Michael Denton's book, how we thought that evolution predicted that we should be able to see on the molecular level how the development of these similar structures was the same. It is so bad that the situation is so bad for evolution that even in frogs that look the same, that the developmental pathways can be totally different. All right. Again, and then here, the way that the digits and the limb grow. Again, totally different mechanisms for developing the limbs. It is almost comical. It's just tragic that the theory has to continue regardless. Here's a recent article that says a study suggests most of our evolutionary trees could be wrong. That's because of this molecular analysis. It doesn't fit with the evolutionary trees. And there's something called convergent evolution. What does that mean? Convergent evolution means we don't know. Every time you see this phrase, it means we don't know how this happened. So just be aware of that.
What is the definition of convergent evolution?
Convergent evolution means you have two separate species that, without interaction and having a similar point, they develop similar traits. I'll give you an example. I think there's like a lizard, I don't know the name of it, some scientific Latin name, in Australia that's developed the same traits as a lizard in Latin America. But because they come from completely different continents, they don't have a common ancestor. The question is, how did they develop the exact same? The argument is that they came from similar environments, but you just have to take a trip to Latin America and Australia to see like the environments are not the same.
I guess another is you have placental animals in Australia, animals that have a pouch.
Marsupials.
Yeah, marsupials that look very similar to other animals which don't have a pouch. And they say, well, why do they look so similar? Well, the answer is convergent evolution. What kind of answer is that? That's not really an explanation. So just to recap, has science explained origins? So really, the Big Bang really hasn't explained much. It only has given us a point of agreement that the universe had a beginning. And we'll go into some of that in a later class, the Big Bang, a little bit more, because it's so much fun. Evolution cannot explain the origin of life. It cannot explain complex molecular machines that are crucial to life, like you just saw. It's important to recognize that it's not just so-called creationists who say this. Even some atheists and agnostics, very prominent scientists and thinkers are also saying this. Evolution doesn't work. I'm going to leave you with this part: evolution, constructive or destructive. And evolution has some very interesting implications, which really have never really been scientifically rebutted. A lot of horrible things can be justified by Darwinism if we just evolved by chance from animals, for lower forms of animals. And scientists have actually proposed that all these things, such as rape and murder, they can actually be understood as evolutionary strategies to succeed. And so we have books like this, From Darwin to Hitler, which caused a huge stir, as you can imagine, which is showing how we got Hitler from Darwinistic principles. Yeah, Daniel.
I think just to build on that, since you mentioned Hitler, I forget his name, but there's a Jewish professor who was expelled from a liberal arts college in Washington State who made an interesting idea that if you think about Darwinism or evolution as the competition between groups, that the Hitlerian idea of wiping out the Jews and Slavs would make evolutionary sense, because you're piling resources to specifically the Germanic group, and that is the main focus that Hitler invaded Russia, was to be able to control Russian resources. And in the process of doing so, somewhere between 20 million to 27 million, the Soviet Union died. The
connection actually between Darwinian principles and Hitler's program of Holocaust is actually pretty clear. So if we have access now to the documents, to the Nazi effort, if you wanted to take a trip there, you could actually see the documents to see how evolution was the scientific basis for this program. And you got to remember that there was no rebuttal. There's no scientific rebuttal to this at the time. And even today, there's no real scientific rebuttal, to what Hitler did. The rebuttal is a moral rebuttal. Again, we have to acknowledge that Christians, they have varying opinions on things like evolution and the Big Bang. They're very famous Christians like Hugh Ross, for example, who accept the Big Bang account. And they're very famous ones who don't. So we're all over the place on this. You don't have to reject either of them to be a Christian. As far as they know, it's the best scientific account we have. So however, I think we should ask ourselves, can it be reconciled with the creation accounts? It's not essential to faith. Is the idea of God creating through survival of the fittest acceptable? To some it is. Does this say that actually death and violence existed before the fall, which is described in Genesis? These are all things we have to try to answer for ourselves. And that's why there's one side is very, very against some of these ideas. The other side says, well, we can deal with it within our faith. So again, just to acknowledge, were Adam and Eve real people? If they're not, how do we decide what is real or not in the Bible? So these are things that you have to answer. I mean, just for yourself. So yeah, Daniel.
I think the question I would have, especially for a lot of atheists and agnostics who believe that the common origin of life theory is that, would that not justify Adam and Eve then? If all humans came from the single source?
Yeah, I think they would agree with that. It's just that they would say, well, Adam and Eve, came from ape-like creatures, and then eventually from a single cell which evolved on its own. There's probably also sometimes you hear some objections that probably can fall into the theological issues. Many people would say that, well, I can't believe that God had to create. If God is God, the perfect God that created our world, He is very inefficient in many ways, right? You have to create so many different species that actually extinct, so many people that get killed, and all that. So it's very unlike a God that you will call a perfect God. Of course, that's their notion. A more modern Western notion of efficiency is the ultimate virtue in a way. Okay, but sometimes you do come across that. You need to address that. Guan, are you referring to the argument about why some species lay so many eggs? Right. Okay. Like that, but that's, of course, that's I don't agree with that. But you hear that. What I'm saying is that you. Yeah. So for example, Neil deGrasse Tyson have used that. That's his strong objection. But Yeah. And I think our response to that would be, this creation is a fallen creation. We shouldn't see predation. We shouldn't see thorns and thistles. But it's fallen. It's God built in a backup plan, I guess you would say. Later, we'll talk about a little bit more how even if we assume, for example, the Big Bang theory is true, it still supports design. It still invokes miracles. These are difficult matters to discuss if you don't read about these things a lot. So really, I think the response would be they're not central to who Jesus Christ is. We gotta look at that first, okay? If you're discussing this with people, and then you can figure out these questions. Miracles. You don't believe in miracles? I think we've just seen that there are miracles we see every day. If we think about cells dividing, if we think about our DNA being duplicated, they depend on miracles. Just because we give something a scientific name and then say it evolved, that's not a scientific explanation. It's still a miracle. That little machine that we saw to untwist the DNA, if science can't give a scientific explanation for that, that's basically a miracle. Personally, to me, my argument would be, look, on the one hand, if I see a cell phone, I can deduce that it was designed. To me, it would be more miraculous to claim that this cell phone was simply the product of millions of years of chance evolution. The same for our biological systems. I think it needs more faith. The interesting thing here, if you look at these verses here, it says, after Jesus rose from the dead, it said when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. I think the problem is we tend to think we're more advanced, we're more modern these days, and we don't believe in miracles because we're more skeptical and we're more, reasonable. But it was the same back then. I mean, even when they saw someone who had risen from the dead, some still doubted. People back then were not more gullible necessarily than we are today. When I was looking, that's kind of what I wanted to share a little bit more about the where we are scientifically, about origins. Any more questions or comments today? Yes. Okay, so as you can tell, I agree with a lot of your questions. There's too many holes in what we know in scientific knowledge, but I guess this might be a contentious question, but I want to raise it. So you lay down the case for God and theism, but my follow-up question is, what is the logical next step of saying this is proof in the biblical God? Particularly for me, for example, like just to get it, I'm a guest here and I appreciate being a guest. I'm not Christian. I would say that I'm a deist. And for those who, like a short elevator speech for those who don't know what deism is originally an 18th century idea that there's a God and God created the universe and set down laws, but then he took a kind of a step back and he's not so much interventionist than he is someone who's kind of, the analogy is like a clockmaker who made a clock, but then step back and let the clock kind of circulate itself. And so I think all the arguments that you made can also lend to deism. So if you approach an atheist and agnostic and say, look at all the evidence here, and they say, oh yeah, you're right, what would be your argument, the follow-up argument that says, and this is proof for the biblical God? Because in my personal experience, I think, particularly on college campuses, the follow-up is, oh, I'm going to be a deist then. Or they don't call it a deist, but they're like, oh, I believe in this. Now, next week, we're going to talk about the Bible in particular, right? It's like, why should we take it seriously? And that's where we're going to say, hey, I mean, really, the Bible is where what you're talking about really comes into play in its claims about who Jesus Christ is. So we'll start to address that next week. And to what you said, the material that we talked about these past two classes, like you said, you can find it, in Muslim apologetics, right? You can find them in Jewish apologetics as well. It's the same data. So yeah, what we are doing is we are showing that belief in some kind of creator is reasonable. Yeah, in fact, more probable than not. And then starting next week, we're gonna go into specifically what that means as far as Christianity. So yeah, good question.
Out of curiosity, from the Christian perspective, is the argument for a theist creation, does that lie more in the New Testament or the Old Testament?
For theistic creation?
Yes, for particularly intelligent design. Like where do Christians, in Scripture, where do Christians mostly point? Do they point to the New Testament or the Old Testament?
That's an interesting question, because so let me say this. When it comes to trying to sort out, for example, questions of origins of the universe, well, actually also for origins of life, I think the direct material is going to be in Genesis, right? The first chapter or two of Genesis. But the other thing is this. The question we're going to address next week is about the reliability of the Bible. And we're going to focus primarily on the New Testament, because once you decide if the New Testament is trustworthy, and then from that you decide that Jesus is indeed God in the flesh. Now, the interesting thing is that Jesus referred to the New Testament, and he referred to the Genesis accounts as literal historical accounts. So that's kind of a backwards validation of what the Old Testament is saying. And when it comes to addressing, for example, were Adam and Eve real, or is Genesis literal? Those are things you have to take into account about what Jesus said about them. So does that kind of answer that?
It does. And I don't expect anyone to answer what my follow-up question is, but I am just curious about CBCM's view. Does CBCM take a more literal approach to the story of Genesis, or is it more interpretive?
I would guess, since we would call ourselves evangelical, I would guess to take a more literal approach generally. But so the thing is this, going back a little bit, actually it's not just Genesis, there's also Psalms and Job, right? And maybe some little verses in Isaiah, for example. But in Psalms, for example, I think in different passages it talks about, for example, God expanding, stretching out the heavens like a curtain or like a tent. And so creationists will look at that and say, is he talking about the expansion of the universe? They also look at passages like that. Okay. And then for smaller issues, we'll look, there are passages, for example, in Job, I think, and maybe that talk about, for example, something called Leviathan or Behemoth. And that comes into play when we talk about dinosaurs. That always puzzled me. There's an animal with a tail like a cedar. And then in the notes in the Bible, it says probably a hippopotamus. Wait a minute. I will say this. We've all heard about the Galileo controversy, how it's church versus science. But it's very interesting that the Cardinal Bellarmine, his stance really was, he said, well, if there's evidence that shows that the earth goes around the sun, we would have to go with it. We would just have to rethink how we interpreted certain scriptures, but it has to be pretty good evidence. I'm paraphrasing. Really the church's stance has always been that we go with reality in that sense. But we have to understand again that Galileo, in fact, he didn't really have good proof for his claims. And so the irony is the church was going with the best science they had. Galileo turned out to be right, but he didn't have evidence. He had zero evidence. So, I mean, the evidence wasn't good enough because there were all these counter arguments that he couldn't answer. Again, we don't fear the science, but the secular alternatives are really, really in a bad shape right now. So let's pray. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this time to just look into just how amazing you are, just the world that you've created, and how you reveal yourself to those who are open to believing. And we ask that you help us to take this knowledge not only to share with those around us, but also to just be, again, in awe of your wisdom and your power, and that you extend this to, we can know that you will extend this also to your love and your grace in your dealings with us. Just help us to worship you with this knowledge. In Jesus' name, amen. There's some interesting theories having to do with relativity. So, for example, if the Earth is actually near the center of the universe, and we have relativity, that could explain how the Earth could be younger, even though it looks like a lot of time has passed further from the Earth. So that's an interesting possibility. Two different scientists have come up with that idea, Gerald Schroeder and Russell Humphreys. There are problems with the Big Bang that require the introduction of a theory about dark matter.
The dark matter itself, it goes back to what you're saying. There was nothing else. Like the Big Bang does not posit that there was dark matter separate from like the core that everything came from.
I don't know what they say about where dark matter came from. I mean, it had to be created in the Big Bang. But then they're saying, well, the reason it's required is because when they see the shape of galaxies and they assume it's being held together by gravity, they can't explain why they're seeing the velocities they're seeing right now. As you move further away from the center of the galaxy, it doesn't make sense. So dark matter has to be posited in order to explain how the Big Bang theory can still be correct to explain how galaxies formed.
But the problem is, as you're mentioning, is that scientists can't even observe dark matter. That's why they call it dark.
Right.
It's just completely theoretical, and it could turn out to be 100% wrong. Like, I mean, Neil deGrasse Tyson himself said, like, we could discover it one day, but for now, we don't know anything about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and see you next week when we talk about the Bible.